Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I hope you're still feeling fairly awake and sane on day 4 of the conference. Thank you, all of you, for making it this far. I really hope that as many of you as possible can make it to the end, because in the closing session, we've got some really exciting special guests. If all goes well, we'll have the former president of COP26, Sir Alok Sharma, coming to say a few very brief words. And you may or may not be aware that there is a carbon dioxide removal film coming out this autumn. And so the editor of that film, Leila Connors, is very kindly dialing in from the east coast of the US. So if you can stay around till the end, you won't be disappointed. But first, well, actually, I want to give you an update on the poll. For those of you who made the morning session yesterday on businesses, you remember we ended on the question of who should decide what constitutes residual emissions. We made a quick online poll. I can tell you the results are in. Coming in joint first place, 33% votes each. People thought governments or the UN. Then we've got standard setters fair way down. For instance, the SBTI at 15%. Taylor Swift got 3 votes. I don't know if Jake Jordan is still around, but I suspect he's one of them. But I'm sure we'll be talking about that more. Actually, one of the parallel sessions later on is about residual emissions. So I realized when I put together this poll that I didn't include us scientists, whether we should get to decide. But maybe those of you in that session, yeah, definitely not. Well, you know, if you get an answer at the end of the parallel session this morning, then do let us know. But first, we're going to talk about how do we ensure carbon dioxide removal supports emissions reductions instead of slowing them. And I'm really, really delighted with the panel we've got. They don't really need an introduction, but I'm going to at least give the chair one. Known to many of you, Holly Buck is an associate professor at the University of Buffalo in New York State, and a prolific book writer, very thoughtful thinker on this. I particularly recommend this book, which I read and hugely appreciated. It's called Ending Fossil Fuels, Why Net Zero is Not Enough, which, as director of a research program called Oxford Net Zero, I thought I really ought to read. So, Holly, over to you.
Oh, thank you. So I'm very excited to be on stage with these wonderful people. We've got here Nils Markusson, senior lecturer at Lancaster University, who has been writing for many years on this topic. Sara Nawaz, who's the director of research at the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal. Maybe you can, at some point, unpack the name there for us. And Zeke Hausfather, the climate research lead at Stripe. And I want to give them all a chance to explain how they're thinking about this problem, but I actually wanted to kick off first with some questions for all of you, at the risk of dialing us into our phones. If you wouldn't mind checking out the poll in the app. I'm interested to take the temperature of the room, how we're feeling about this topic. And so the first question being, how concerned are you about the prospect that carbon removal development slows down emissions reductions? So we've got a couple of responses coming in already. So for those of you who are not on this app, I'll just report what we're seeing. We've got about a quarter of people extremely concerned. The majority so far responding concerned, about 35%. 17% somewhat concerned, about the same not so concerned, and only 3 people are not at all concerned. So a topic of some concern. I'm glad we're going to have this conversation. To be a bit more provocative, I have a second question here. How concerned are you about the prospect that fears of mitigation deterrence slow down the development of carbon removal? And so people are generally less concerned about that, but still, so far we've got about a third of people concerned, 21% somewhat concerned, 30-ish% not so concerned. So we'll see how that goes as people have more time to answer this question. Maybe we'll revisit some of this at the end. And the final question, how easy or challenging do you think it will be to address the risk of mitigation deterrence? So most people are optimistic that it is possible to address. About 60% of people say it's a major challenge, but possible to address. 2 people think it's impossible. 30% of people say it's moderately challenging. 7% say it's relatively easy, and unfortunately, nobody has responded, it's easy, and I know how we can do it. So I can't call on all of you, but I will be calling on you 3 since you're our expert panel. So to kick us off, I wanted to hear about how you diagnose this challenge. Where do you see the danger here? How does the situation of mitigation deterrence or delay on emissions reduction come about? And what are the dynamics? And I was hoping to start with you, Nils.
Okay, well, thanks, Holly. I was going to start with just a little bit definitional work. So mitigation deterrence or risk of delay is the risk that doing or promoting carbon removal might undermine other kinds of emissions reductions efforts. And just to clarify a little bit, it's not necessarily about, a common counter-argument is that it's such a marginal thing, it's not going to matter, right? It's so difficult to get it done, it's so difficult to get it to any scale, it won't have these kinds of impacts. But I think that's a misunderstanding. It underestimates the importance of merely talking about it, the talk as such, the rhetoric. I don't mean that in a bad sense, but the way of talking, way we talk about carbon removal has impacts, real impacts in its own right. So it's not just implementation. It's also not necessarily an intentional thing. There's probably some intentional uses of the CDR promise to avoid doing emissions reductions and delaying it. But a lot of it is emergent effects from the kind of society we live in, right? So it's not necessarily, unlike the definition of moral hazard, it's not necessarily in an intentional game-playing kind of thing. It is how the world works. It's about protecting profits, in short, I think. So that's the basic thing. Why am I worried about this? So one thing I am seeing in the real world out here is both governments and companies being really quite optimistic, hopeful about CDR, but whilst being very pessimistic about emissions reductions or very vague about their ambitions to pursue them. So there are several papers out on this. We heard many of us heard Harry Smith talking about it yesterday, for example. So that seems suspicious to me, for sure. It's easy to then believe that this CDR optimism is an excuse for not doing other things. Similarly, I think CDR optimism sits very comfortably along a lack of ambition in terms of phasing out fossil fuel, a lack of ambition, targets, policies, etc., for stopping deforestation, peatlands, etc., etc. A lack of ambition as well about reducing consumption, essentially, right, of carbon-intensive things. So that coexistence is a little bit too cozy and too comfortable, I think. And often in this space, we construct the need for technology as a way of avoiding politics, which is really, really a false choice, right? Look back at 30 years of failure to do CCS and tell me that isn't about politics. Tell me that isn't about people in some way, right? So it's a false choice, right? We have to really, I'll get back to that, but we have to do quite a lot of people work to get carbon removal happening. And finally, if that's all right, yeah, one more point. I am currently properly interested in why the knight in shining armor of innovation hasn't come to the rescue. Why are we left in this muddle where we're in? Why has it been so hard to abate those emissions? I think it's really important to look back in history. So hard to abate has a particular meaning right now related to residual emissions under net zero, right? But it's been hard to abate emissions for a long time, of course. I call it this is difficult problem. It's like taking a car to the garage, right? Say, ooh, this will be expensive. And it's been very expensive and very difficult for many decades, right? Why is that? How is that? What kind of real? Some of that is real, for sure. Some of it is missed opportunities, R&D we didn't do 30 years ago when we could have. Let's see how those decisions, priorities were made. And some of it has always been empty excuses, right? Oh, it's difficult, we couldn't possibly, right? So to look into that history would be really interesting to understand more what's going on right now. I think it's not a new problem. It's not CDR specific. It's been with us for a long time. Thanks.
Thank you. And Sara, what about you? How do you understand this problem?
Yeah, thanks, Holly. Well, I also just want to say it's great. I'm grateful to be with this great group. So thanks for having me. A couple thoughts that I can share on sort of diagnosing this problem of mitigation deterrence. You know, I think the framing of net zero. An amazing sort of political innovation to kind of get through intractability on climate change, but also, and Nils and colleagues have written about this quite extensively, but sort of bakes in certain equivalencies around carbon that I think can be really problematic and exacerbate this problem of mitigation deterrence. There's a great quote from a piece that Danny Cullen-Ward and colleagues have written around offsets that sort of, to make them work for the Paris Agreement, sort of nearly everything about them would need to change. So I think there's, pieces where, there's other reasons also to kind of worry about that model for sort of moving forward on CDR and decarbonization, but I think, double counting being some of them, human rights abuses, things like that. But I also worry that kind of some of the equivalencies around carbon, can exacerbate this mitigation deterrence issue as well. Another thing I wanted to talk about was just the role of the fossil fuel industry. So I think there's a risk of sort of lock-in of fossil-based systems that CDR can sort of exacerbate. So, in the absence of kind of policies to hold those institutions accountable or phase them out, I think, there's a risk that there will be a perpetuation of this kind of status quo. And I think that is relevant to kind of, the kind of obvious pathways that we think of, sort of DACs and BECS and direct ocean capture as well, potentially. But I also worry, in a hypothetical 10 to 15 years from now, are OAE, ocean alkalinity enhancement startups, going to be getting bought out by fossil industry? And what does that mean, and how can we kind of insulate against that? I guess I don't know. I'm a social scientist. I think a lot about things like public perceptions and justice, and those are also issues for me that I can't not mention when it comes to sort of fossil industry's role in CDR. So just mentioning that as well. And I guess the last piece that I would speak to is the question of kind of competition with other resources that could be sort of needed for decarbonization more broadly. So that could be land, that could be energy, that could be water, that could be other things. Right now, most kind of estimates for this kind of, if we're thinking about what is the scale of CDR we need to be doing, we tend to kind of use top-down temperature target methods for sort of coming up with that number. And the sort of bottom-up estimates that exist of what's the sort of scale of this pathway tend to focus on sort of what's the maximum potential scale. So I would love to see us have more of a conversation around like what is actually a more reasonable, kind of sustainable, socially feasible scale, and how does that shift our conversation in terms of, as it relates to mitigation deterrence? Are we sort of estimating a bit too highly and then planning too much for too much CDR?
Thank you.
So I think we as the CDR community need to get better at acknowledging just how contingent the value of CDR is on us succeeding on the mitigation challenge. So let's look at some really quick numbers. Say we are wildly successful and get durable carbon removal down to $100 a ton. Say we spend $22 trillion on pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, removing 220 gigatons of CO2, reducing global temperatures by 1/10 of a degree C, and say we don't reduce emissions, they stay at current levels. We end up in a world that's 2.6 degrees by 2100 instead of 2.7 degrees by 2100. That's something that has a value. But that's not the best use of that money by any stretch of the imagination. It's much cheaper to mitigate in almost all cases, and it doesn't give us much value as a society. Where CDR works, and why CDR is unique, and why we're all here really, is that it makes the math of net zero work. And if we're not on track for net zero, then what's the point? So I think we need to center mitigation whenever we're talking about CDR in a really important way, because it makes the math of CDR relevant for society. But more broadly, when we think about mitigation deterrence, I really see three separate issues at play, separate but related issues. The first, I think, is what I would call near-term mitigation deterrence. So companies who are making decisions today on whether to mitigate or to do removals and what the trade-off there is. And I think, depending on what we're talking about, that may or may not be a big issue. Traditionally, in voluntary carbon markets, I think we can all acknowledge it has been a big issue. Today, if I were to go and buy a ton of carbon on the voluntary carbon market, it would cost me about $4 a ton. As a private company, it is almost always cheaper to buy an offset for $4 a ton than to make any sort of change in my business to reduce emissions. And that's a problem, because it doesn't actually cost $4 a ton to mitigate carbon. And the fact that we can pay for that today is a real problem for the space. And even $12 a ton for reforestation is not the price it actually costs to do that properly, and is a price point where maybe 2/3 of mitigation would be cheaper to avoid by paying for reforestation credits. So I think the price of CDR today, particularly some types of CDR, is a problem. We can get later to some of these questions around what you should be able to use CDR for, and Miles has many opinions on this that I share as well. But I think that's a big issue right now, is simply the cost of credits are so low that it does create a near-term moral hazard for many companies who can write a check for $30 million, call themselves carbon neutral, pat themselves in the back, and move on to doing other things like emitting fossil fuels. The second area that I think we as an academic community tend to focus a lot on is the role of CDR in our models and the risk of mitigation deterrence there. This assumption that we can do less mitigation this decade by having large amounts of CDR, 3 times the land area of India for BECCS is the classic sort of example in IAMs, later in the century, to pull carbon out of the atmosphere then, have these sort of very elaborate overshoot scenarios where we get up to 1.7, 1.8 C by the middle of the century, pull temperatures down to 1.5 C by large-scale net negative emissions. I do think that models are far too cavalier about overshoot and the challenge of actually mobilizing political will to deal with it once we've gotten to 1.8 C. But at the same time, I don't think that this is really the barrier to mitigation today. We already have our integrated assessment models saying that we need to get global emissions down 50% by 2030 to stay on track for SSP 1.9, for example. If we were to have less CDR in that model and that number was 60% by 2030 instead of 50%, policymakers aren't going to make any different decisions today, because we're not going to hit 50% by 2030, nevertheless 60%. I don't think that's a realistic constraint on what's happening around mitigation right now. But I do think particularly our increasing reliance on overshoot and the assumptions around CDR that are incorporated into that are a problem, and we need to be more clear when we're talking about that. And then I think the final issue when thinking about mitigation deterrence here is the risk of using CDR for greenwashing. I worry a little bit that we're going to see companies make meaningful investments in CDR that might represent a couple % of their operating revenue, but they'll spend 99% of their advertising revenue talking about these amazing investments they're making in CDR. And so there's a risk of giving moral license to continued emission activities from relatively small outlays of capital, and I think we should be cautious about that.
Wonderful. So we've heard a variety of ways that this dynamic can emerge. What should we do about it? Who wants to start? Maybe we can go with you again, Nils.
All right. No, sure. My main message here is that we need to challenge the interests of capital head on, really. We need to take the fight. And we do that by adopting targets for fossil fuel phase out, for stopping deforestation, for protecting peatlands, etc., for reducing consumption of many things. Doing CDR is not a way around that. That's not an easy thing to do or to say, but CDR is not a way around that. There is no choice between technology and politics. Look at the history of the failed history of CCS for 3 decades and tell me it ain't about politics and about interests. It is. So we have to do that first, right? It's a really important thing. And that would then reduce the temptation of using CDR as an excuse. We would still need it, we would still have to do it, right? But it would just take the pressure off in terms of misuse of the idea of CDR. So to do this, you need to understand the political economy, to understand CDR in context, in the actual society it is in. It is a good idea. In this kind of society we're living in, it's a tricky idea. It's problematic. It's an unruly thing that causes problems as well as helps us solve things, right? So it's about dealing with that unruliness. So we need to understand it in context. We need to understand the political economy it's in, the society it is in. We need to support popular mobilization. We need to get people active. We need to have activism. We should probably have alliances with Just Stop Oil and people like this, right, actually. And we should have them in here right now, probably, right? Again, CDR is not a way around, away from politics. That's just a doomed way of thinking. It's just we're just going to repeat the CCS failure if we do that, right? We need the politics. One concrete way of doing it is to have much better scrutiny, as you know, about residual emissions. What are they? What kind of claims are being made? Who is making them? Based on what? How real are they, etc. As a way of keeping up pressure on companies and on governments, for sure, right? And final thing I want to talk about today about what to do is to go beyond lip service. I think a lot of us are writing papers or policy reports and say, oh yeah, we need both, and oh yeah, no, we need separate targets. And then we get on with business, right? And that's not okay. This is a pretty real problem, as I was happy to see your poll results about that. And it needs more than that, right? So, beyond lip service. We need a bit, there are rooms for lip service as well. Sometimes you have to be brief about it, but we have to take it seriously, and it is used as a sort of, it is now something you have to say. It's something you sort of mandatory introduction to papers and reports and whatever, but that ain't enough. We need to take the next step and take it seriously. Thank you.
Me next? Yeah, I mean, I have a few notes that I think either of these two are going to speak to, so maybe just recapping without stealing too much. Finding ways of enforcing regulations of greenwashing claims, of course the separation of removals and reductions, as I think came up in a session yesterday and probably many other sessions. Finding ways to enforce emissions reductions, gradual reduction targets for high emitters with penalties. But a couple kind of things that I wanted to talk a little bit more in depth about was, first of all, going back to my point about the fossil fuel industry, sort of reining in their influence and control. So a couple thoughts. These are sort of maybe slightly more practical potential sort of actions that private companies could take. I'm thinking of announcements that Heirloom made recently around sort of limiting the role of equity, sort of oil and gas intake, equity in a company, representation on the board, making potentially commitments around use of removed CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, and then potentially, commitments that early stage startups could make around sort of potential buyouts by fossil industry in the future. And then going to that point on kind of, trade-offs and resources and what's the sort of truly sustainable level of CDR. I think there's some work to be done, academic research to be done. I know an academic researcher saying there's more research is not the most original, but I think there's work to be built on around this kind of idea of bottom-up research that really tries to understand what is a truly sustainable scale here. We can go on examples, I think, that already are doing pieces of this, like land gap, roads to removals, net zero America, that sort of try to map in this bottom-up way, in a sort of place-based way, what actually can actually reasonably be done, and what are some of these trade-offs with other decarbonization goals. And I think that just the last piece is I really would love to see us as a sort of community explore ways to make sure that CDR is done for the right purposes. So not just as a way to kind of, as you've been speaking to, offset continued business as usual, but rather as a way to sort of compensate for residuals. And I think there we really need to define how, to your point, Nils, as well, what justifies sort of legitimate residuals. So they're generally defined technically based on what is hard to abate, but I wonder whether we should be defining them in a slightly different way around what is sort of socially valued. So one of my worries with market-based approaches is that the people who, or the groups, institutions that produce the emissions are the ones who kind of get to define what the residuals are. So one approach, Duncan McLaren's gonna, I think, speak to this in a session later today, is developing sort of deliberative, collaborative processes for determining which residuals are kind of quote unquote legitimate, developing sort of a portfolio of these, having a national agency that would be tasked with sort of accounting for that sum total of corresponding removals based on sort of national removals targets, and then tasking that agency with investing in CDR accordingly based on that sort of level, and funding it with payments from the sort of sectors that produce those residuals. So a few thoughts there.
Good thoughts. I think on my end, first and foremost, making sure that we set a high bar for what constitutes a credible neutralization claim using CDR. I think CDR by itself in all its various forms has value. I think where we get into tricky territory is when we let people trade off the value of CDR with the value of emissions, particularly fossil CO2 emissions. And if we do that in a way that's not appropriate, we can cause unintended outcomes. And I think that's what lies behind a lot of the fundamental mismatch today between the cost of mitigation and the cost of both avoided emissions, which dominate most of the carbon markets today, but also the cost of some removals. So I personally am quite fond of this like-for-like framework, where if you have fossil CO2 that remains in the atmosphere for hundreds of thousands of years and whose warming persists for millennia, you need a mechanism to remove carbon over a similar lifetime. Some sort of storage in geologic formations, in mineral form, in bicarbonate in the ocean, other mechanisms that remove it over a lifetime commensurate with fossil fuels. And if we pursue those sort of options, we fix a lot of the primary misincentive here around mitigation deterrence in the near term, which is cost. Permanent removal is expensive. It's probably around $500 on average today across different pathways. The cheapest numbers I've seen credibly today are close to $200 a ton. And at $200 a ton, if you're buying large-scale permanent removals instead of reducing your own emissions, if you have a choice to reduce your own emissions, you're setting money on fire. It's not an economically rational decision unless you're making a particular play to support innovation, novel technologies, the other reasons many of us in the room might support spending money on this today. But you're not doing it instead of reducing emissions, because it is more expensive in 90% of cases, and certainly today when we're very far from net zero. So making sure that what we're claiming is actually symmetric with what we're doing in the case of neutralization claims, I think is really important here. That's not to say that there isn't a huge need to do other forms of removal that might be less durable. There is a real value to planting trees and reforestation more broadly. There's a lot of land use emissions and other short-term emissions where that can be credibly neutralized with those approaches. And even when neutralization claims aren't being made, we need large-scale public spending from governments and others to restore ecosystems to get carbon out of the atmosphere soon. So I don't think we should let the perfect be the enemy of the good for less durable removals, but at the same time, I think we should be really careful about these sort of neutralization claims that are being thrown around in carbon markets today and the perverse incentives those could create. But even beyond this distinction between durability of removals, we need to make sure that we have a high bar for claims being made in the field writ large. I think the history of the voluntary market is a cautionary tale here, and it's a cautionary tale not because of the bad intention of actors going into it, but because once you create a market for things, and particularly when you create a market that's dependent on claims around counterfactuals, what would have happened if we hadn't have done this, you create a lot of potential for abuse, for manipulation, for bad actors to come in. And it is difficult to police the absence of an emission. It's difficult even to police certain types of removals when what is being measured is inherently uncertain in some cases. And so making sure as we move forward with these approaches, we set a high bar, we make sure that the rigor that many of the early players are bringing to the space is continued as it goes from a very, very nascent industry to one that has many billions of dollars being spent each year behind it. And I think the registries are going to play an important role there. Governments are going to play an important role there. There's a lot of actors that need to get together and set the bar high now before there are strong political interests who can lobby to keep it low. And so we're sort of in a very important time for the market right now where we can set these standards high in a way that hopefully will be durable and avoid some of the mistakes we've seen in the past. So that's one area. I think another is just making sure that we are having claims around both neutralization, but also the idea of net zero more broadly, prioritize mitigation. I think for all of the flack that we give them, the folks at Science Based Targets Initiative fundamentally got the framework right here. We need a separate target for how much private companies should reduce their emissions and how much they should be able to use for removals in cases where they either don't have control of a portion of their emissions or a portion of their emissions is simply too expensive or impractical to remove. You know, we can get into a debate about what are legitimate residual emissions. I think that's a fun debate to have, but I do think that no matter what, we shouldn't have a company, you know, having 80% of their neutralization coming from, or 80% of their reduction in emissions coming from neutralization rather than actual emission reductions. And so separate targets are an important mechanism to be able to differentiate there and to ensure that, you know, mitigation actually occurs no matter what happens with markets around either avoided emissions or removals. And that will drive a lot of innovation on the emission reduction side as well. And so keeping to that as a North Star, that, you know, we need to center mitigation in all of these commitments to be credible, particularly as we start seeing more and more net zero claims, is important. But also we need to be better at policing those claims. You know, 5 or 6 years ago, it was very trendy for every company to call themselves, or even worse, one of their product lines, carbon neutral. What that actually means is very much up for debate, and very few of those claims were remotely credible. You know, we're starting to see some pushback from regulators now. We've seen lawsuits against some companies for their claims. But it wasn't that long ago when I went on an airline flight and they announced over the intercom that this flight is carbon neutral. No, it wasn't. And that's a problem. And that's also going to affect people's perception of this if they hear those sort of claims all the time. Like, they're going to rightly think this isn't credible, because it isn't. And so we need regulators, we need governments, and we need the private sector to do a better job at being clear what is legitimate uses for CDR and what is not.
So you partially anticipated my next question. I wanted to invite us to get a little bit more specific about who exactly has the responsibility and the capacity to act on this problem. So you mentioned registries, companies. Sara, you mentioned what researchers can do. We've talked a bit about policymakers and governments on different scales. We haven't talked so much about the public, but presumably they have some agency and capacity. So one, are there actors that we're leaving out in this solution space? And two, you know, how do we get people aligned so that we're talking about the same thing? I mean, I think we've developed some language around it, and that's one step, but are there other ways to draw this constellation of actors together to push action here?
I wanted to answer that by going back to the poll results earlier. So there's, is mitigation deterrence a concern? 25%, we had a, sorry, it wasn't the poll. We had a question about the, who needs to set the standards, who needs to set the targets, and the answers were predominantly governments or the UN, right? And that speaks to an intuition, I think, that the free market might not be the best actor or kind of arena to deal with this, right? So it speaks of an intuition about the need for planning, essentially, right? So states have a really important role here, right? But states don't do things just because it's a good idea, right? Academics tend to think that having the best knowledge, having the clever answer is the way to solve problems, right? But it's as a digression then, I have been quite active in the labor union back at the uni, and lots of members think they have a really clever way of winning over the employers, just being clever, having the best tactic, and it's not about that. It's about fucking power. It's about, you know, showing that you're strong, and that's, so that's how you, and it's the same thing here, right? It's about states actually exerting power. But states don't do this just because they're nice or because so we need mobilization. We need people out on the streets. We need to probably spray things orange, right? There are quite a lot of things in Oxford that could do with a bit of orange paint right now, to be honest, I say. So that's how we get the things spinning, right? The wheel spinning in the right direction, I reckon. Thanks.
I do think we should be a little more clear-eyed than we are sometimes about just how far the private sector can push this out of the goodness of their heart. You know, I work in the voluntary carbon market, so obviously I think it can have an important role to play, and I think it is one of the major drivers of innovation today. But companies are only going to take action to the extent that it doesn't significantly impact their bottom line, unless there's either a credible threat of or the existence of regulation that requires them to do that. And so I think we need to start engaging government more across different levels to try to both codify standards around these things, but also create real incentives to scale in these markets. Because voluntary initiatives are important. They're going to help us test a lot of these things, see how they work in the real world, see where they fail, to hopefully give governments a lot of the information they'll need to set effective policy. But the only way any of this scales, and to be honest, mitigation writ large scales, is through governments playing a much more active role, either in direct procurement or in creation of compliance markets, or take-back obligations or other tools that can lead to significant action. So I think I don't know how to make governments do that. I'll leave that to folks who work with social movements a lot more. But I see that as, if we're going to use this decade to figure out what works and what can scale for CDR, we also need to use this decade to start creating the mechanisms that's going to lead to scale next decade. And that really has to focus on the policy side.
Want to add anything?
Well, at a risk of going on a little bit of a tangent away from this, I think, I feel like I agree with what you're saying, Nils, about the role of government here in sort of being a corrector to the market in this way. But something I'm thinking a lot about right now is how we can sort of get help from sort of government in this space without making things too susceptible or vulnerable to sort of electoral politics. So how do we kind of navigate that? Not sure I have great answers, but would love to discuss, perhaps.
I want to ask you all one more question before turning to the audience questions, and it's on this role of government and policy. So we've heard about a few different types of policy actions: procurement, regulating compliance markets, phase-out targets, maybe something around residual emissions. And Zeke, you mentioned your carbon neutral flight. So Canada just passed a law, C-59. I think it has a much more even boring title than that. But basically, it's known colloquially as the greenwashing law, where it says that organizations can't make claims about environmental performance that can't be backed up by internationally recognized methodology. And so on one hand, you have the Premier of Alberta saying that this will stifle billions in investments in emissions-reducing technologies. On the other hand, you have environmental advocate groups very happy about this, and also calling out statements that they say could be misleading, like CCS is a proven, reliable process that is being used around the world as an example of something that could be regulated under this law. So I think we can see some of the complexity here around governments taking up the mantle of deciding what's greenwashing and trying to regulate it. And I'm curious if you think this is a step in the right direction. Should the rest of governments be emulating Canada? Is this one of the actions we should have in our menu of things to fight the specter of mitigation deterrence?
I mean, I think you raised an interesting tension there, right? Like, there are a lot of different views, particularly with the environmental community, around many of these technologies. There is certainly a segment of the community that considers almost all of CDR writ large as a false solution or distraction from what we need to do. And so there is a risk if mechanisms like this are written too broadly that, to what weirdly agree with the Premier of Alberta, there are some cases where this could stifle investment in needed technologies. But I think the language of the law you mentioned, like recognized international organizations or bodies, is important here. Like, I think as scientists, as IPCC authors, as folks involved in the international community, if we think this is a good route to go down, we need to make it very clear what is an acceptable claim and what is not an acceptable claim, and so give a roadmap for companies who want to do the right thing to follow, so we can effectively deter companies who want to do the wrong thing. Because there is a risk if we don't, it's just going to lead to everyone pulling back. And we've seen this a little bit in the last year in a different context, which is there has been a lot of much needed criticism about the quality of carbon markets in the last year. Folks like Patrick Greenfield in The Guardian writing front page articles about 90% of credits from REDD+ being bogus, represent a much needed realignment. But part of the response to that has been a large scale retreat from that market by companies, even from the good stuff, because they're worried that they're going to show up in one of these exposés because they don't know what's good and what's not good. And they don't have an easy way to determine that. And so I think if we do go down this path, and I do think there is an important role in regulating some claims here, because there have been claims made in the past that are very misleading to consumers, we need to make sure it is clear what claims should be made, not just what claims should not be made, and how companies can go about doing that in a way that they feel comfortable and are going to minimize the amount of criticism they get.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, if the starting point is that greenwashing is a pretty big problem in general and in this area, then the question is what else could we do? I mean, what are the alternatives really? So I guess the sort of default would be public debate, just challenge claims that are being made, right? And again, I think that's easy to believe in as an academic because that's sort of how we try to operate at least. But again, it's about power, right? It's about enforcing standards. And the government is a very plausible actor to be able to do that. Some alternative would be to set industry standards where an industry stakes its collective reputation on living up to a standard. But yeah, no, I think I believe in trust government a little bit more there. Doesn't mean it's not plain and simple, but yeah. Just one thing. I think this will help address some of the problems, right? But who's going to hold governments to account for their greenwashing, right? It's a different ballgame again.
Just to riff up that a little bit, I do think you raised an important question here, which is governments are not perfect actors themselves. In the U.S., we have this forever war against corn ethanol in the climate community, which has been, an example of how the sort of government science nexus can go wrong. If there is enough money and enough incentives and enough political actors who are very bought into something, there is a way for them to be very selective about what science they accept and what science they don't accept, and not that many mechanisms to, force them to use a better model that might give results that are politically unpalatable. So I think governments are generally more trustworthy than the private companies here, but governments are also susceptible to many of the same forces of political capture. And we can't necessarily trust governments to follow the science, as we've all seen over the last few years.
Yeah. We have many great questions from the audience. So, Sarah, did you want to comment, or should I turn? Yeah. Well, I also want to flag that at 11 a.m. there's a session specifically about residual emissions. So questions on that, I might ask you to come to that session and ask them then. But we have a question. If CDR did not exist as an idea, do you think emissions reductions would be treated with any more urgency, or would we humans just use other excuses to defer climate actions we find inconvenient?
Well, maybe a response question is just if we're in this hypothetical, is like SRM also not an option? Because I think one possible response is to say, there's maybe folks who would say, if CDR weren't a thing, we would just double down on emissions reductions. And maybe other folks who would say, if CDR weren't a thing, then maybe we just jump to SRM. So.
Well, so which deterrence is the worst deterrence? Because I've heard some people say that CDR might deter SRM. I think I'm very concerned that all of these might deter adaptation in some way. Mm-hmm. I don't know. There's a lot of deterrences lurking around every corner here.
Yeah, just that. I mean, this is not CDR specific, and of course, there's lots of excuses for inaction, and it's not And again, it's not about the arguments really, or even the options, right? It's about power.
Yeah.
Yeah, and at some point, I'd love it if we could work in what we've learned from studying other deterrences, or vice versa, what can we learn from studying mitigation deterrence in CDR when it comes to things like, I don't know, should we be deploying more nuclear? Has that been deterred? You know, there's many, many things that the logics may apply to. But
To the question, like, I might be a little provocative and say, in a world where CDR didn't exist as a concept, I don't think global emissions would be meaningfully different. Like, I think individual company emissions might. I think there certainly are some sector level effects that you could pick out, but I don't think it's been a meaningful driver of the fact that we're still at 40 gigatons today versus, 35 or 30 or any measurable change in that at a big scale.
I mean, what do you say if somebody says, the reason we're not going to phase out fossil fuels is because we have authoritarian producer states that don't know how to diversify their economies? CDR is basically irrelevant in the list of reasons why we're not phasing out fossil fuels. So why do we still need to be talking about it?
I mean, I think the decisions individual companies and other individual actors are making are informed by CDR, and CDR can certainly be used as an excuse not to take action. So like maybe there is a world where not having CDR would be able to lead to our ability to push petrostates, for example, to do more than they would otherwise do. But I just think that the reason people are emitting today is not because they're banking on CDR. It's because it's too expensive or too politically inconvenient to mitigate in most cases. And I think the solutions to the problems with mitigation are less going to be about restricting CDR and more about making mitigation cheaper or changing the politics of it to create stronger incentives for leaders to actually mitigate. I don't know, it's a balance. Like I think mitigation deterrence is an important thing, but I also think it is not, by any stretch of the imagination, the main reason why we're not succeeding at mitigation.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, I think carbon removal can have a role. I think we may have to change society a little bit before it can have a proper role, but it's conceivable and interesting and important. I think mitigation deterrence from carbon removal is a thing that's worth talking about for exactly that reason. But I agree, there are more important things to study, to be honest. I find it interesting, but it's not the big picture in a way, right?
But it could be generalizable. So Juanita has a question. What are the best real-world examples of mitigation deterrence that you've seen?
Okay, so there is a special issue with case studies out there. I would have to say, where Juanita has contributed a great study from Switzerland about the point about lip service I was talking about earlier. She and co-authors had a really good discussion there about the way talking about mitigation deterrence is now become a sort of mandatory thing you have to do, but then you can get on with it. So I forgot to mention her earlier. So that was a good opportunity to do that. One of the best case studies in there was about the petrochemical industries and the way that narratives there around circularity and circular carbon has really helped obscure, legitimize the status quo in the petrochemicals industry and obscure, crowd out other alternatives, other feedstocks, and of course, as ever, demand reduction. So that's one of the most solid papers, case studies I've seen so far. I can recommend it. Palm et al.
Thanks.
I think that to my earlier example of airlines, there certainly have been some individual examples of companies or products claiming carbon neutrality, which, if you let companies off the hook by doing that, it does directly create a reduction in the incentive to mitigate. Because if you're already carbon neutral, like what's the point of going carbon negative? I guess it's more advertising benefit than carbon neutral at the margin, but it's certainly hard to justify the costs. So I think there definitely are some examples of mitigation deterrence at the company level in the past.
Yeah. I think I agree with that, absolutely. I mean, I think the only thing, just going back to this overall question of like how worried am I about mitigation deterrence, which I feel like has been the sort of unarticulated question here that we've been talking to. I guess the only thing that I maybe slightly disagree with that's come up so far here is this question of cost. I think tend to be a little bit skeptical of sort of the claim that economically rational choices will always be chosen. So I think that is often the case, but I can also imagine scenarios or contexts in which countries just opt to just pay for expensive CDR in the interest of sort of not getting to avoid reducing emissions that they're quite attached to, or companies maybe not necessarily, it being a lot easier to just kind of incrementally continue to emit versus trying to sort of make a more economically rational sort of big leap earlier on in the process. So basically all to say, I tend to be skeptical about this kind of economic rationality argument. But also think that it's often the case that Zeke's argument stands up very well. So,
no, it's a good point. And there's one school of thought that would say, at that point, like if we put the bar high enough for neutralization claims, does it matter if it's not economically optimal?
Yeah.
Like if we spend more money to do removals than mitigation, presumably that money could have been spent on something better.
Yeah.
But the people choosing to make that expenditure are not choosing to spend it on something better. So it's sort of a question of what is the ideal use of those resources versus what is the choices that society or individuals who control those resources are making. I do think we need to be very careful on how we design systems, though. Like one thing I've been thinking about a little bit recently in this whole debate about Scope 3 emissions and the role of offsetting there is that we could end up driving too much resources toward CDR if we force companies to use CDR for emissions they don't control in a way that's not optimal. Because most companies don't have the ability to reduce their Scope 3 emissions. And for many companies, the majority of their emissions are someone else's Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And so if we say every company, you need to reduce your Scope 3 emissions, which you can't actually reduce, so you need to buy CDR for that, we would potentially lead to a misallocation of resources toward too much CDR, which is a weird thing for me to be saying because we don't have enough CDR today. But when we design these systems about how individual actors in the economy have to balance mitigation and CDR, we need to make sure that we are incentivizing the mitigation in the right place and the CDR in the right place.
So 2 questions following from that. Generally, again, how should different players prioritize reducing current emissions versus CDR? And more specifically, Miles would love to hear the panel's thoughts on the UK Supreme Court's decision this week that fossil fuel extraction license decisions should take into account the environmental impact of Scope 3 emissions. I want to speak towards that.
Could you say the first question again?
Yeah. How should different players prioritize reducing current emissions versus CDR? Which you've just been talking about, but anything more to add specifically to these different players?
For me, at least, I kind of like simple heuristics. And so I think this sort of 90-10 heuristic that we've been throwing around of 90% mitigation, 10% removals is a good thing to aim for. Obviously, it's going to differ by sector. Some sectors are going to have, like agriculture, larger sources of emissions that they can't directly mitigate. But making sure that we're defining like what is the bar for mitigation at a sectoral level that you need to hit to make a credible net zero claim, I think is a good way forward there.
I'm struggling with the question a bit. It sort of assumes, I think, that CDR is up and running, and we know how to do it, and we know how to govern it, and we're not really there yet, right? So the question is, what should actors do to make that real versus reduce their emissions? And I mean, they're just not equivalent, right? You can't meaningfully trade them off against each other in the short term, not generally speaking. So it seems, yeah. So they should support CDR development as much as they can, whilst also reducing emissions as much as they can. It's as simple as that, really, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point around just this. I find this a really difficult topic to think through, I think in part because of these tensions around time horizons and sort of what makes sense to be prioritizing in sort of investment or research on CDR across different pathways and how likely we think each of them are to pan out. What is sort of a really worrisome mitigation deterrence risk right now versus in 10 years versus in several decades. So basically, I don't have a great answer, but I think this time piece is part of why it's difficult. So.
Mm-hmm. And to that end, I do think to backtrack a little bit on what I previously said, net zero is not the only thing that matters, right? There are other allocation of resources that have meaningful impacts on ecosystems, on technological innovation, on other things that are going to set us up to meet these challenges in the future, but might not optimize for emission reductions immediately. And so I think we should celebrate when governments, when companies, when others are willing to spend money on things today that might not give the biggest amount of carbon reduction per dollar spent, but might put us in a better position in the long run to actually get to this world we want. Exactly how to measure impact is obviously a huge and hard question, but not everything has to be seen in this sort of carbon myopic lens.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, could we ask Miles to elaborate on the question about the High Court? I need to hear more where the question is coming from, I think.
It's, I think, very exciting for this conference because the Supreme Court has ruled that environmental impact assessments for new oil and gas licensing decisions will have to take into account the environmental impact of Scope 3 emissions, and the ways in which an applicant, an oil company, could address the environmental impact of their Scope 3 emissions. As Zeke has pointed out, they don't control the stuff once they've sold it, are relatively few. And is the only way potentially the only way a company could comply with the Supreme Court's decision is by getting rid of the CO2 associated with the products they sell. Job done. So, I very much doubt whether that's the way this will unfold, but I do think it needs to be pointed out very loudly that that's the way it logically should unfold.
Yeah, okay, right. Well, I mean, regulation is also a way of permitting things to be done, right? And I suspect that this is what's playing out here, right? Rather than just telling the fuckers to stop, it's a way of making them produce a nice statement about the environmental impact, and well, we've tried as best as we can, right? So that's a bit vague answer, but I mean, I suspect that's the politics of what's going on.
Yeah, and for my earlier comment about Scope 3 incentives being problematic in some cases, I think this is an example of where it's clearly not. The fossil fuel producers are the ones who should bear some responsibility for the emissions of their product, and so it makes a lot of logical sense to tie carbon removal to the production of fossil fuels, as you and others have suggested. Whether the politics of that are feasible, I think, is a separate debate, and it's going to differ a bit by country. But it certainly makes a lot of logical sense to have producers be bearing the responsibility for removals and pricing things in that way.
I'm not sure if I'm not understanding this, but is part of the worry that this might just be compensated for via CDR in some way, or is that not really necessarily a concern here?
But how would that be a worry? I mean, if they get rid of the CO2 associated with the products they sell, more power to them.
Well, I think this goes back to this question around, like, should we be equating, given that right now it's sort of like a voluntary carbon market forest offset based.
No, I don't mean getting rid of it by planting trees. No, I mean getting rid of it.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to actually ask a question that relates. It's from Robin. How concerned are the panelists that CDR would not only deter emissions but cause active harm in the real world? For example, through driving large-scale land purchase and land conflict, incentivizing the destruction of forest for BECCS, et cetera. Because I think, to Miles's point, if we did have a lot of oil companies relying on this, there may be, like you pointed out, Sarah, an unsustainable level of CDR being bet on.
Yeah.
Maybe just to add to that question, not just how concerned are you about this, because I think we're all pretty concerned, but which of these risks is the main concern for you, or that stands out?
Yeah, I mean, I think I tend to worry more about that kind of thing. It's probably just the way that than mitigation deterrence, maybe. That's just sort of the work that I do, is thinking a lot about how paying a lot of attention to the history of how attempts to optimize for one thing tend to have spill-on effects for the social a lot of the time. I think carbon and carbon management is one of those things. Basically, if it's not, if we're optimizing for the carbon, then we're not necessarily paying as much attention to these kind of issues around that you just mentioned, Holly. And I think, yeah, those are also sometimes harder to measure, harder to understand, whether they're sort of tangible or intangible social aspects.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's because they're harder to measure and harder to quantify and harder to model. That's part of the problem, right? Yeah.
And I think there is a risk of real near-term trade-offs between resources put towards CDR and resources put to decarbonization. So to give a concrete example, right now in the United States, it is almost impossible to get a power purchasing agreement for renewable energy on any realistic time frame because of challenges with interconnection queues, siting restrictions. It's not a money problem, it's a infrastructure problem. And so if we decide today to require oil companies to build huge DAC plants to undo their emissions, and those DAC plants then buy up all the renewable energy that's being built to power the DAC, that's being used for that instead of being used to displace coal and gas on those local grids. And so that's not to say that that's always going to be a problem, but we need to be careful as we scale these technologies that we're accounting for the trade-offs between both other decarbonization goals and other impacts on communities and society. On the flip side, there are some approaches for carbon removal that have co-benefits that I think we can acknowledge as well. Certainly things like enhanced rock weathering can enhance crop yields for farmers and reduce other greenhouse gas emissions. There's some uses of biomass that have co-benefits and being able to displace fossil fuels. And so when we're thinking about this broader ecosystem of CDR, we should also make sure we're not just focusing on the carbon side, but also what are the costs and benefits to both the local communities and to society as a whole for different approaches and different scales.
Totally, and also potentially a space to be aware of potential greenwashing around sort of, seeing, I don't know, I work a lot in the ocean alkalinity enhancement space, and so I see a lot of claims around co-benefits that might, for example, for shellfish farmers, that might not necessarily pan out. And yet that is a lot of how folks sometimes are going in messaging in terms of sort of community engagement or a local conversation. So just greenwashing again.
Yep.
Yeah.
I wanted to pick up a related topic that we mentioned before. So Sara, I'm super with you on cost being a really dodgy decision criterion, right? For all those, what's socially useful is and there's so many more things we can do with energy and with biomass, and there's so many hopes attached to biomass now, right? It's supposed to do so many things for us. It's completely crazy. And what you said about the difficulty of quantifying lots of the things that really matter, justice issues, notably. But you also said earlier that we tend to go for maximizing assessments, right, rather than looking into resource competition. And I'm not a modeling buff at all, right? But isn't that kind of what models actually do? Slightly okay in a way, right? That we do look at resource competition much more than justice, obviously. Is that not true, or am I missing?
I also am not a modeling buff, so yeah. I mean, I think I'm just really trying to speak to some of the work that I'm seeing that's kind of more bottom up, more trying to think about what kind of potential there is for enhanced rock weathering or ocean alkalinity enhancement or so forth. Tends to be sort of like what's that maximum possible potential.
Yeah.
And then there is more kind of some of this trade-off analysis. I mentioned this already, but the land gap work or Net Zero America, other examples of where that trade-off analysis maybe has come in more.
Yeah. All right. No, I get you.
And certainly the integrated assessment model world hasn't always been the most realistic at including trade-offs. Like I doubt anyone in this room is particularly bullish on some of the BECS numbers in the earlier generations of IAMs, for example. And I think the broader CDR community is becoming a bit more realistic that we need a portfolio of approaches that's going to shift in composition over time to, minimize these trade-offs and scale responsibly. And it's not going to be 3 times the land area of India with BECS.
Yeah.
It's also a really challenging task to do. I don't mean to throw out this super ambitious proposal that is in many ways incredibly difficult to do, but I just think if we have that as an aim, then we can move more in that direction. So.
I think what you're saying also speaks really, there's really need for contextualization of CDR, right? And at multiple scales. It's about the big picture, it's about the fossil economy, blah, blah, blah. But it's also about local places where people actually live and eat and sleep and whatever they're up to. Yeah.
So we've had bringing us back to the solution space here, we've had a top question for a while from Alice, which is, what are your thoughts on having 3 separate targets for emissions reductions, permanent CDR, and the land use change in forestry, LULUCF? Would that help avoid mitigation deterrence, and would that be feasible to implement in policy?
I'm generally in favor of separation. Exactly where the practicability kicks in, where you end up with too many targets to actually handle them is a hard one, but that sounds sort of doable to me without being super expert on it.
I think I broadly support it, and I do think having separate targets for biosphere and geosphere removals, or durable, less durable, whatever distinction we want to call them, is useful just because there's not a way to have them be fungible in a market like they are today without creating a whole host of problems. I think we need to invest in both, and having separate targets creates incentives to invest in both in a way that, pretending they're the same as we all do today, or at least as carbon markets do today, is problematic. I think there's obviously a trade-off with complexity, but having some balance there is useful.
There's a question also for you, Nils, from Steve. Do you think we would be having this debate in a non-capitalist society? If so, how would it be similar or different?
All right. Wish I had some empirics for that. Actually, would we have it? Yes, I think so. I think it plays out particularly badly in the kind of society we live. Lots of it comes down to cost. It comes down to cost optimization, which has sort of been embedded in modeling since at least the 90s, right? So it's a way of thinking. We're living in a kind of society that needs to see everything as commodities, and therefore quantified, and therefore simplified and reduced, and blah, blah, blah. So there are reasons to think that our current society makes this a particular problem. Will it go away in other kinds of society? God, no. I wouldn't imagine, right? There will be. How will it look different? Yeah, really good question. Obviously have no. Well, could go to North Korea and see what they're up to, maybe. I don't know. The interesting question. Wish I had some answers.
Well, maybe I'll ask you another question while you're answering. Nils says, we as scientists need to go beyond lip service, moral hazard of CDR. Actually, this isn't just for you, Nils. Do the panel have examples from them or others of going beyond lip service? Question from Kaspar.
I can start with a caveat. You can't delve into the complexities of this in every paper. No one asks that, right? That's not what anyone's saying, I think, or in every policy report, I guess. It's a bit cheeky calling it lip service, but I think there is a tendency. And Juanita, where are you? In here somewhere, I think. Oh, there. Hi. You can speak to this maybe as well, right? What are there any good ways of getting past the lip service? Any good examples of going beyond it?
Okay, you what? Sorry, I was actually taking a question, so I didn't.
So
Can you repeat the question?
the question was about this phenomenon that you identified, right? About in policy reports and in the discourse about saying, oh yeah, we have to do both, and maybe we have to do separation, and then you just get on with it, right? So I've been calling that lip service, although that is a little bit cheeky, I think. But the question was, can we see good examples of how to get beyond that?
Yeah. So I mean, I'm having a presentation actually in the next panel exactly on
Good.
that. So maybe I can
Excellent. Thank you.
Do you want a short answer now?
Sorry?
You want
sure.
a short answer?
Yeah. Please.
What we say is that saying both residuals and removals are needed, or phrases like that has become more or less as a automatic response to avoid backlash, public backlash on CDR, instead of something that actually actors are reflecting on really what does this mean and how do we implement this. So we are basically calling for more reflection on issues that you have touched upon, such as what do we define as residuals, and also how much can we trust in the promises of CDR.
I mean, I think an example that I'd point to again here of a good faith effort to strike this balance correctly is what folks like Science-Based Targets Initiative have been doing, which is actually setting separate targets and trying to enforce those. I think the challenge, of course, is going to become when the rubber meets the road on enforcement and when people complain about the cost of mitigation and making sure that we stick to our guns in requiring deep mitigation. And we're not quite there yet in most cases, but certainly that is a framework that does a good job of creating separate targets and not conflating the two.
So a question about, actually there's two, about the like-for-like principle. Well, the first one is, does geological/durable net zero or the like-for-like principle lead to more mitigation deterrence by changing the politics of net zero, i.e. focusing on novel CDR, which is current at very small scales? And then there was also a question from Philip targeted towards you, Zeke. Like-for-like is great in principle, but in practice is difficult to deliver. Why not transform the market's carbon metric from carbon ton to carbon ton year to incentivize long-duration CDR? So if you all want to speak to those.
I can do the first one. I think yes. Short answer is yes, I think. So like-for-like principle would mitigate towards, as it were, novel CDR. But if you then also go away from the carbon reductionism, if you take all the co-benefits, et cetera, and impacts into account, have that richer analysis of it, then it's less clear again, right? So, and that's a limitation, I guess, of the like-for-like principle is still mainly about the carbon, right? And we need to. Depends on how you interpret it. If it is about all the other things as well, then no.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with that. I think there's a lot of critiques that have been made around sort of, yeah, exactly as you're saying, carbon centrality, or sort of the hegemony of carbon, or whatever terms you want to use. The importance of just valuing other things. And of course, that's incredibly difficult to do in an accounting system. And it's probably not at all practical to do, but I think there's an inherent sort of boiling down that is problematic for other things we want to optimize for beyond carbon.
Yeah. I think a widespread adoption of like-for-like would lead to more emphasis on durable removals, more emphasis on mitigation simply because of the cost of removals, and less emphasis on reforestation, afforestation, and avoided emissions more broadly. I don't think that's necessarily always a great outcome if, again, to your point, we're being carbon myopic. Like, I think part of the problem with this market, and one of the reasons that we are having this debate in the first place, is that we don't have a mechanism to value biodiversity, to value all the other benefits that many of these biosphere carbon solutions bring. On the flip side, I think a lot of the environmental community has been willing to overlook some of the physical climate problems with relying on biosphere carbon storage because there is no other market besides the carbon market. And so it has to implicitly sort of carry the weight of all these other co-benefits. And so I think the solution there isn't to try to force a round peg into a square hole, or vice versa. It's to actually create markets or incentives or pools of money that get spent on restoring ecosystems, not just for the carbon benefit of those ecosystems. And in many cases, the projects that have the maximum carbon benefit are not the projects that have the maximum biodiversity benefit. Like if I want to maximize carbon benefit for an ecosystem, I'm going to make a timber plantation and extract as much timber as I can to maximize the period in which trees are growing quickly and removing carbon from the atmosphere. That's not good for the ecosystem. That's great for carbon. And so I just think making sure we're designing systems that have a goal of actually accomplishing the goal we're trying to do is important here. Otherwise, you create perverse incentives. To this question of tenure accounting, and I've been outspoken on it in the past, certainly, I think we as a society need to decide what our goal is. If our goal is to maximize value for humans today with some assumed discount rate for the future, frameworks like tenure accounting make sense. That's sort of the standard economic paradigm, right? We have a discount, we assume people are going to be richer in the future, and therefore damages in the future are less important than damages today. And then the value of removing carbon from the atmosphere today is much higher than the value of avoiding emissions in the future. The problem is we have decided to set targets around temperature levels, for better or worse. I for one, think in the long term, since I'm a climate scientist, I kind of like this approach. But we have decided we want to limit warming to well below 2 degrees. And if we've decided that that is our target, tenure accounting simply doesn't work. Like it breaks that math. Because if you remove 100 tons from the atmosphere today and then release it next year, that has absolutely zero effect on global temperatures in 2100.
I think it also, the question sort of assumes, I think, a sort of smooth future that sort of gradually develops into one way or another. And I'm not sure that's the kind of future we're looking to. There could be all sorts of quite radical disruptions and ruptures. And then basically one saying, we're fucked, stop thinking about the money and about the trying to optimize it. We're beyond that now, right?
Yeah, there's a risk of kicking the proverbial can down the road, and that future generations aren't richer. We're really creating a huge inequity for them, and so there's a huge debate here around intergenerational discounting and how to approach these problems, and it also touches on issues like SRM, which are at very similar dynamics. But we could spend the whole day talking about that. I don't know how far down the rabbit hole we want to go.
So there's a bunch of questions about targets, which I'm actually not going to get into as we start to wrap up, but I invite you to talk to these wonderful, kind people about them afterwards. I want to ask a question from Shin about what we're calling this thing, right? So, and this is oriented towards you, Nils, but I think we'd all have thoughts. If we see CDR as part of mitigation, what does mitigation and mitigation deterrence mean? Should we call instead abatement deterrence, or should we separate CDR from mitigation? I'm also going to put on the table phase-out deterrence as a more specific formulation of what we might be worried about. And even I think some people are talking about behavioral change deterrence. There's also a question in the queue that points to the fact that many of us, like myself, have taken airplanes to get here. And I think sometimes, if you think about aviation, where there might not be other viable technologies right now, there's definitely people who would recommend flying less. So should we be more specific, or should we talk about this in a different way than just a generalized mitigation deterrence?
You guys start, I think.
I think definitely it tends to be helpful to have more specificity up to a certain point. So, I agree. I think this is what a lot of Nils has been saying around, let's be really explicit around phase out of fossil industry. And let's talk about that. Let's keep the focus on that. And I think behavioral change is a different dimension of this. It's less of a structural change that needs to happen. And so probably a different way of thinking about it is necessary. I'm just trying to think as well about other types of deterrence that might be worth adding into that list. Yeah. Not sure right now.
Yeah, no, I agree about that. I think fossil fuel phase-out deterrence, mitigation deterrence is a pretty awkward phrase in all sorts of ways. Talking about fossil fuel phase-out deterrence would be good. It misses out the important land sector a bit too much, right? So there's probably multiple deterrences. And I was trying to say before, talk about other mitigation and emissions reductions. So calling it mitigation, of course it's mitigation in some sense, and it's an unfortunate phrasing in that way. I blame Duncan for that.
He's conveniently not here, although he will be speaking at this panel at 11. I believe it's in L2. You can hear Juanita and others continue the conversation about residual emissions. So final question that I want to wrap up with. Nils and all, what role do arts and humanities play in the people work mentioned? How can we mobilize a change in conversation, culture, and perception of these challenges?
I think lots of NGOs are doing good work already, right? So it's maybe how to see how we can support them, and some more dialogue with NGOs, finding out what they need, trying to tell them what we know. So this is that is something we can do. I'm not sure that social scientists are necessarily very good sort of communicators, or some people are doing really good work on you've done work, right, on public engagement. I mean, some of that will have help, I guess, right? It's not really my thing, but
Yeah, I don't know if it falls in the arts category, or what was the category again?
Arts and humanities.
Arts and humanities.
This could be a lot of things.
Well, maybe to make just a very vague statement, I think the role of history is a humanity, and I think, finding, you were describing some work around sort of talking about histories of how claims, sort of certain technologies get developed or not developed, so kind of potentially a really interesting role for showing how, showing those examples in the study of history and kind of bringing them forward to show, how a lot of these decisions that we're seeing in terms of what actually qualifies as a hard-to-abate technology is historically constructed and a product of certain decisions that have been made already.
Yep. No, that's
still your idea, though.
No, thank you. But maybe I misunderstood the question. If we're a bit narrower about what art and humanities means, then absolutely helpful to imagine telling the story. Some of the things that are the problem here about the power relations and stuff are really hard to model, right? So it's about having other kinds of language. So it's about inventing stories, inventing language to talk about things that are very, very important but very hard to quantify and model, right? So that's a kind of role, language creation role, I would have thought. But also to imagine other kinds of realities. We are pretty stuck in a particular way of thinking, most of us, most of the time, right? So it's about broadening our horizons, thinking about those other societies and how this problem might morph in those. For example, let's write a novel about that, shall we? That'd be good.
Yeah, maybe just to riff on that, I mean, Holly has done this in her writing, but just kind of telling stories about the future, using fiction, science fiction, climate fiction as a tool to help us envision other ways that things could go. So not just getting locked into certain political, economic scenarios, which are our current reality, but really also trying to think about, like, what else is possible? How else could this go? And how does that, maybe it's not totally, it doesn't set us up for super practical next steps, but can kind of help us reorient a sort of longer term vision for how all of this could play out.
Mm-hmm. And I think as we think about how we communicate about this more broadly, like figuring out what are narratives to talk about both the challenges and opportunities here that will resonate with the broader public, because the level of nuance we often talk about like for like and balancing of timing and trees versus durable removals is completely lost in many cases when people actually hear about offsets. And I mean, most people don't even know the distinction between offsets and carbon removal. And so creating narratives to better talk about these things and make it so the public response is reasonable and isn't a complete rejection of everything CDR related, but also isn't a complete embrace of everything dubious is itself a fundamental challenge.
Yeah. So come to the panel later on with the filmmaker and ask her about that. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Holly.
Can I just add my thanks to Holly and the whole panel? I think that was a really nuanced discussion, and it involves science, but also politics and worldviews. And I'm really glad we can have that discussion in a very constructive way. Just got a quick photo, that one at the top that I thought Nils might like. So you've seen on the slides all the time the very nice Oxford building called the Radcliffe Camera. This was the Radcliffe Camera. Miles dug this one out. When was this, Miles?
A year ago, Saturday.
Yeah. And actually one of the Just Stop Oil activists who sprayed the orange Powder on Stonehenge, I think, is probably an Oxford student. So yeah, the building's usually pretty orange, but it was particularly orange that day. Okay. We just have one more thing I want to cover very quickly, which is, if we go here, I want to invite Matt Giddon up on stage. Been a key part of this conference. We have some good news. I wanted to share this with all of you in the conference, certainly before too many of you left. Hopefully you are staying for the film producer and the COP26 president. But a lot of you have been coming up and asking me, it's great, we've got a third International Negative Emissions Conference. Will there be a fourth? So Matt, what have you got to tell us?
Yeah, so hi everybody, Matthew Giddon from EASA, which you can see here. So it's our good pleasure to announce that it is our plan to host the next version of the Negative Emissions Conference at EASA. This is just outside of Vienna, Austria. And we're doing this as part of a wider European research project called Uptake. And so I wanted to mention there's a lot of really good, robust discussion just now. We also talked about, I think Zeke explicitly mentioned, issues around model-based mitigation deterrence. And so this is one of the things that we're hoping to deal with in Uptake, is to update through an interdisciplinary process, working together with social scientists, economists, the integrated assessment modeling community, to update our integrated assessment models, at least in Europe, to better tackle these problems. And so as part of that project, we're happy to host the next conference. I can say we obviously can't compete with the deep and storied history of Oxford, but what we can offer is the Habsburg Summer Palace, which is, as I said, just outside of Vienna in a little town called Laxenburg. And EASA also is, I would say, deeply entrenched in the history of the problem and the discussion that we're having here together as a group. So while it was founded to actually support scientific diplomacy and coordination between East and West during the Cold War, it's moved and evolved to where we have multiple programs trying to look at the tricky and complex issues around mitigation, carbon removal, climate, biodiversity, and all of these interconnected trade-offs. So we're very happy to invite you there in approximately 2 years' time, and looking forward to see you all then.
I'm really pleased. It's also quite orange, that building. It's a bit of a theme.
Habsburg yellow.
Habsburg yellow, sorry. Okay, Miles, super quick question before we all go to coffee.
So given the conversation we just had, should it be the carbon dioxide disposal conference to emphasize the intimate link between carbon dioxide production and responsibility for disposal?
You don't have to answer that, Matt, don't worry. Unless you want to, but
I would say, no, I think negative emissions, right, is two pieces. One is obviously disposal of carbon dioxide removal, or disposal of carbon dioxide, but the only way we're going to get to negative even with CDR is with strong emission reductions. So I think it makes sense to keep it in the context that it is.
Great. And that is why Matt is leading the next conference. Brilliant.